imagine, if you will, kicking off your teenage years as a harem slave, being bought by the Sultan of Egypt. Then, pretending your late husband is still alive while you quietly assume control of your country, hoodwinking one of the most formidable armies in the world, ending a crusade, capturing the King of France and selling him back at a small fortune. Perhaps we're jumping ahead a mite quickly, friends, but that's rather appropriate considering that we are discussing Shajar al-Durr, self-proclaimed Queen of the Muslims. While the threads of her life proved to be rather short, they wove a dynasty that endured for 300 years. Not too shabby, as resumes go. Now, before we begin, let's address the llama that has surreptitiously appeared in your learning circle today. Oh, there he is. His name is Daryl, and those wild gesticulations he's making remind us that historians at the time wouldn't have been jazzed about crediting Queen of the Muslims with too many accomplishments. Thank you for the reminder, Daryl. Now, let us launch the tale of Shajar al-Durr, squasher of crusades and ransomer of kings. Shajar was either Turkish or Armenian and entered the world sometime in the 1220s. The first record that we have of her existence is from 1239, which lists her as a harem slave for the Caliph. Ayub, the Sultan of Egypt, bought her in 1240. Now, she might have truly cared for the Sultan and might have just had good survival instincts, or most likely some mixture of both. When Ayub was captured by his cousin 8 years later, Shajar willingly accompanied him to jail and gave birth to their son Khalil there, although the boy did not survive beyond infancy. And maybe it was the loyalty that she displayed by tagging along for that prison stay, or he truly connected with this harem girl that he'd purchased. But for whatever reason, Ayub declared Shajar his favorite wife when they returned to Cairo a year later. The Sultan hung around his palace for about 12 minutes and then sped off for the city of Al-Mansura to fight against the Seventh Crusade, which he kind of started because Egypt had recaptured Jerusalem. While in camp, a supersized abscess formed in his leg, forcing doctors to amputate. He died shortly afterwards, and Shajar discovered that her doorstep was about to become significantly more French. I'd apologize for that, but I'm not truly sorry. Now, the Sultan's death arrived at a spectacularly inconvenient time for Egypt. One of Louis IX's main goals for the Seventh Crusade was to destroy everything that the Sultan had built and use Egypt as a springboard for a larger prize, sacking Jerusalem. It's always Jerusalem with these guys. France was super into its own military prowess, and the trash-talking started even before anyone stepped on a battlefield. Louis's first act of violence was not leading heavily armed knights into battle, but creating a strongly worded letter. He taunted the Sultan about the butt-kicking he'd be receiving. The king then escalated to YouTube comments level. Even if the Sultan agreed to converting all of Egypt to Christianity, Louis promised he'd still hunt the Sultan down anyway and kill him, quote, at your dearest spot on earth. If you polled the rest of Europe, they would have bet on France, and they would have been irresponsible not to. The Kingdom of Cheese boasted some of the strongest fighting forces one could find at that time, and the king somehow managed to simultaneously be well-loved and intimidating. As a bonus, the Sultan's son and heir, Turan Shah, unfortunately, we'll talk about him a little bit later on, wasn't around. Well, have you ever seen Weekend at Bernie's? Now, obviously that plan couldn't work forever, but for a few weeks, Shajar simply pretended Ayub was ill rather than dead, and asked everybody to be respectful and leave him alone until he recovered. Ayub's chief commander forged the Sultan's signature on official documents. Servants brought his meals to the door. Musicians performed outside his chambers. A doctor that Shajar trusted made the rounds daily, although he likely just indulged in a power nap and played some GoldenEye and then left. The truth did leak, of course, but Shajar had constructed an impressive power base by then and was essentially running Egypt. He did, eventually, but Turan Shah missed all the drama because Dad sensed his son was kind of a total muffin head and shipped him off to Turkey in order to keep him away from the throne. That was working out well until Turan Shah learned of the Sultan's death. So he and 50 of his friends embarked on a road trip, riding the long way round to avoid getting intercepted by hostiles. They arrived in Damascus, and there he officially became the new sultan, although Damascus is in Syria, not Egypt, and he spent the next 3 weeks bribing troops and city officials to be loyal to him before moving on. France. France assumed that it could phone the battles in and head home. Instead, it won a few small skirmishes and then caused a series of unfortunate events, each worse than the last. Since Turan Shah was still en route, leadership of the Egyptian army passed to the Bahri Mamluk commanders. Ayub's Mamluks, specifically, were Turkish Muslims that had served as his personal army. Now, some accounts claim, friends, that the plan Egypt devised was crafted by a Mamluk commander and Shajar merely agreed to it. Darrow the Lama, though, points out to y'all that other sources credit Shajar for developing the plan and note contemporaries wouldn't have tripped over themselves to praise her, a former harem slave and a woman, for strokes of military genius. Well, regardless of who developed the strategy, what we do know for certain is that the Egyptians opened al-Mansura's gates, permitting the French knights to enter the town. As they clanked through the streets, it began to dawn on them that they couldn't see or hear any activity, and maybe that was sort of odd. The entire place seemed deserted, and then the gates closed and the Egyptian forces emerged from their hiding places and attacked from all directions. While the knights were trying to understand what in the name of Jonathan Taylor Thomas was happening, Turan Shah finally checked in and sprinted over to al-Mansura so he could command his army. He ordered ships to be transported over land and then dropped into the Nile behind the French vessels that were already there, which created a blockade against any naval reinforcements France might send. But the Egyptians weren't about to leave Louis' ships afloat either, so they binged a season of Game of Thrones real quick, brewed a few batches of wildfire, and began the torching. Yeah, it turns out wildfire was real. George R.R. Martin based the concept on Greek fire. We're not positive about the actual composition, but most historians now believe it was likely crude or refined petroleum, with some sulfur and resins added, hurled through a pressurized tube. A flamethrower, basically. Now, the majority of the Crusaders didn't survive Trojan Town, as I've come to think of it. A few who did retreated to a nearby village where they camped in ditches for weeks, but the Egyptians followed, captured the Crusaders en masse, and packed them neatly onto ships bound for Cairo. With most of his knights dead, starving, or succumbing to disease, Louis IX began to realize that perhaps the invasion wasn't quite progressing in the manner he'd hoped.
Listen, it pam to admit this, but I'm impressed. You fellows aren't half bad fighters.
Oh, we know. So we will be surrendering, then?
Tell you what, we've both 5 heures d'Avilos over the course of the.
Actually, no. We are a handful of soldiers down. Your entire force is collapsing.
Whatever. Details. I'm feeling generous today, so I'll give you the mieta back.
How generous of you.
Hey, it's a substantial porcity.
We are quite aware. It is just cute that you think it is yours to gift.
And in exchange, you can return Jerusalem to me.
Excuse you.
And a few Syrian coastal towns.
I am not sure you understand how surrendering works. You are done, Lou. We know it. You know it. Face reality and go home to your warm bed.
Never. I have got you fools right where I want you. Ah.
A couple nights later, the remaining crusaders slipped away in the middle of the night, but precision frays when nerves are high, and they forgot to destroy a pontoon bridge they'd set over the canal. The Egyptians followed and wrapped the Seventh Crusade up with a pretty pink bow. Thousands of French crusaders were killed or taken prisoner. Louis IX and a handful of nobles fled to a nearby village but were captured. The king surrendered after a eunuch promised he wouldn't be slain. He and his two brothers were shipped back to Al-Mansura, where he was imprisoned, chained, and kept under the guard of a different eunuch. Egypt was really into eunuchs, friends. I don't know what to tell you. And how did France respond to this humiliating defeat on the world stage, having its intimidating, trash-talking king captured, and worse, that such an embarrassment occurred at the hands of a Muslim country, and the most unforgivable insult of all, that said country was ruled by a girl? They didn't take it well. Too proud and fearful to admit what actually happened, crusaders in France initially claimed that Louis IX had defeated the Sultan in a great battle, but the ruse could not be sustained for long. When the truth arrived, French citizens became convinced that a loss so devastating could only be a sign God had abandoned them. Some had their faith so seriously shaken that they converted to Islam. Others caused the Shepherd's Crusade. Approximately 60,000 farmers and peasants grabbed their tinfoil hats, abandoned their homes, and invaded Paris so they could force a kingly rescue. Side note, France loved recycling the names of its crusades almost as much as Peter Gabriel loves choosing the same album title 4 times in a row. There were 3 different Shepherd's Crusades in France within 70 years. The attempted rescue of King Louis IX in 1251, that was the first. The farmers believed that the French church and nobility weren't doing enough to save their beloved monarch. Of course, they had no idea what had actually transpired in Egypt, nor did they have the slightest clue about the logistics that would have been involved in rescuing the king, but they didn't allow any of those boring details to slow them down. The movement's leader, an elderly Hungarian named Jacob, who called himself the Master, met with Blanche of Castile, Queen Consort of France. Blanche was acting as regent at the time, as Louis was sort of tied up. As the Queen wouldn't permit the mob to cross the left bank, it split into several different factions. Some groups expelled the Archbishop and threw priests into the river. Others attacked monasteries. The Bishop of Orleans denounced the crusade, and the Master's group responded by punching him and other nearby clerics. They also beat up some University of Paris students before moving on to Jews. Blanche had been reluctant to use force against the mob, fearful of recreating the University of Paris strike that had caused chaos 20 years before. Eventually, her patience ran dry. She ordered the crowds to be arrested and then excommunicated. Since the farmers lacked any real leadership apart from the Master's group, that was not a terribly difficult task. Lest we forget whose story this is, dear reader, let's circle back to Shajar al-Durr. Shajar negotiated a peace treaty with Marguerite de Provence, the Queen of France, Correct. Blanche was Louis IX's mom, and Marguerite was his wife, although Blanche was about 90% retired by the time of Shajar's birth. No, they were both consorts. Look, do we want to switch over to a deep dive on royal succession in medieval France, or do we want to get back to Shajar al-Durr, who's been patiently waiting throughout this entire sidebar? Shajar and Marguerite hammered out a treaty that would return King Louis to France if Marguerite paid Egypt a ransom of 400,000. Now, I did my best, friends, to determine what the modern equivalent of that would be, and I simply could not locate a reliable source for currency conversion dating back to 1250. Not for France, anyway. But we do know that that amount constituted about 30% of France's total annual revenue at the time. Louis Louis had to agree to never set foot in Egypt again, and he, along with his brothers and 12,000 prisoners, were released. The rest of the French crusaders were killed. There are conflicting reports of how the Queen of France, Marguerite, reacted to her husband's involvement. Some say that she... When your story involves multiple people who are quite interesting, it's difficult. Fair. So at this point, y'all, Louis IX has been returned to France, the entire country is reeling from humiliation, and the Seventh Crusade has ended. But Turanshah, Shajar's stepson, is still the new sultan. Remember him? The guy that waltzed in at the end, didn't really contribute anything, and was able to claim the throne without even physically being in the country? Historians at the time categorized Turanshah as, quote, a complete dork pants, claiming that he was unbalanced, of low intelligence, and had a nervous twitch. He also drank openly, which was not a popular activity in a Muslim country, and often threatened and abused anyone within his vicinity while drunk, particularly women. On one occasion, he ran about chopping the tops off of candles, shouting, "This is how I will deal with the Bahri Mamluks." Now remember that the Bahri Mamluks were his late father's personal military force. Ayub wrote Turanshah letters asking that he honor and rely on the Bahri, advice that he completely ignored. Although he was officially sultan, Turanshah suspected he wouldn't be considered a true ruler unless Shajar and the Bahri were removed from the scene, so Dork Pants appointed his own Mamluks for the top jobs, replacing everybody who had helped him ascend to power in the first place. Included on his to-replace list was Shajar herself. Turanshah also demanded that his stepmom surrender Ayub's wealth and jewels, and Shajar had other ideas. She teamed up with the Mamluks, and what happened to Turanshah next made Grigori Rasputin look like an amateur in the death department. It started when the Mamluks stabbed Turanshah, so he fled to a nearby tower. Then the tower was set on fire, so he jumped out and plunged himself into the river. Then he got stabbed in the gut by a spear, then he was shot from shore with several arrows and somehow still didn't die, and finally, one of the military commanders just waded into the river and hacked him to death. Now, with Dork Pants removed, Shajar officially became sultana, not as a regent but a full-on monarch. She printed her own coins and had the Friday sermon pronounced in her own name. Both of these steps were really important for securing her legitimacy and were virtually unheard of for a woman. There is debate among historians regarding why exactly the Mamluks supported Shajar. Her demonstrated military and political leadership during a crisis certainly helped. Also, the Mamluks needed their new leader to have a strong link to the previous dynasty and their legitimacy, and as the late Ayub's favorite wife and the mother of Khalil, Shajar was uniquely positioned to provide that. They called her Khalil, which translates Mother of Khalil. Maybe, like myself, you're wondering if George R.R. Martin, our favorite bearded glacier, dubbed Daenerys Targaryen Mother of Dragons based on a similar principle, and it's possible. Like Shajar, another former slave who suddenly found herself a ruler, and one who was supported with the military might of slaves who chose to remain by her side, Daenerys had coins printed when she arrived in Meereen, and the slaves of Dee called her Misa, which translates to mother, which is Old Giscari slang. And though I don't believe Maarten has ever confirmed it, fans believe that Old Gis is modeled on Carthage, which is modern-day Tunisia. Tunisia is not terribly far from Egypt. In addition to king ransoming, Shajar gained new skills rapidly. She continued the negotiations with Louis IX that Turanshah had begun. She preserved the lives of the French prisoners, recaptured the city of Damietta, and liquidated the few crusaders who were still hobbiting about. Egypt remained peaceful during her reign. Less than 3 months, or over 7 years. It depends. Officially, her reign ended after 80 days or so. If you might imagine, not everybody was thrilled with being ruled by a woman, and the person with their nose most bent out of joint was the Caliph. Remember him? Guy who owned Shajar as part of his harem when she was a teenager? and he was not at all happy about his former slave now running a country, and he threatened to cause bucket loads of drama if the Mamluks didn't replace her. "We've heard that you are governed by a woman now," he told them. "If you've run out of men in Egypt, let us know so we can send you a man to rule over you." In order to calm the haters, Shajar married Abek, her late husband's taste tester / accountant. Abek was already married, but everyone chose not to notice. Technically, he became sultan at that point, but he spent the majority of his time away from Cairo dealing with troublemakers, and it's likely that Shajar actually continued to run Egypt for another 7 years. Most sources maintain that she chose him because he was unpopular and easy to manipulate. A couple years into the marriage, friends, Ibek was still having trouble with the Bahri Mamluks, including some of the same ones who would install Turan Shah and then Shajar herself to power. He decided that the best way to fix his situation was to pick up a third wife. Some sources write that Ibek was also tired of Shajar doing his job and everybody knowing that he was sultan in name only, and this was made a lot worse by the fact that the Bahri Mamluks already considered him sultan in name only. 5 days into the guy's rule, they chose a 6-year-old Syrian boy as sultan and announced to the world that Ibek was merely the caliph's representative. This stunt did not really have any legal ramifications, but it did mean that a fair amount of salt had already been jabbed into that particular wound. So Shajar, she learned about Ibek's extra wife through servants, and she was not pleased. She had made him sultan, sort of, and this was how he repaid her? She lured her husband to her bath by implying the romance was not dead, and then ordered her servants to strangle him. Some accounts have her slipping away as they killed him, while others say that she joined in, kicking him and rubbing soap in his eyes. Shajar relied on the Mamluks to protect her as they had previously, friends, but she lost that gamble. Al-Mansur Ali, Ibek's 15-year-old son from his first marriage, succeeded him as sultan, and he allowed his mom to choose Shajar's fate. Ibek's ex imprisoned Shajar, ordered servants to beat her to death with wooden clogs and dumped her naked corpse over the city walls. In another version of that story, none of that happened. Shajar slipped while attempting to kill Al-Mansur Ali and was murdered by the ground. That account was the preferred one in the streets at the time, but most modern scholars doubt its veracity. Ibek was highly disliked. Rewriting Shajar's death allowed nationalists to use her story as inspirational marketing material, as often occurred during that age. Well, that's always the question, isn't it? We know that the dynasty Shajar started, one where the Mamluk servant class became the rulers of Egypt, went on to endure for 300 years, and that it repelled Mongol and Crusader invasions until the rise of the Ottomans. Even if that was the extent of her participation, and it probably isn't, that's a decent-sized note. Among contemporary historians, her involvement remains a fiercely debated topic. The chroniclers who were embedded with the Crusaders barely took notice of her, and the Arab scholars theorizing back then were evenly split as to whether her influence was overrated or whether she was actually running the show for years, as well as being the brains behind Trojan Town and her stepson's fall from power. Now, I know which side of that line I lean towards. Now that you have heard the tale of Egypt's king ransoming Sultana, where you stand is something only you can choose.